State, you want to call your next witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. The state calls Tarah Helsel.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
You raise your right hand this morning.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you should give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your full legal name for the record.
Tarah Helsel.
Please spell your first and last name for the court reporter.
Tarah, last name Helsel.
Thank you.
Please have a seat. Helsel, the microphone in front of you moves up or down, doesn't go back and forth.
Okay.
Ready?
Yep.
Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you introduce yourself to the jury and tell them where you're currently employed?
Yes, my name is Tarah Helsel, and I work at RJ Lee Group.
And in what capacity do you work at that group?
I am a forensic scientist and the manager of the forensics department
How long have you been employed by RG Lee?
since November of 2016.
Can you give the jury a background into your education?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science degree in forensic science from Waynesburg University.
And how about some of your training and certifications?
Sure. So I had to complete RJ Lee Group's training program for gunshot residue analysis. And this was a several month-long process that involved reading and learning the standard operating procedures, reading relevant publications about gunshot residue. I had to complete the analysis of 250 case samples, of which my results were compared to that of a trained analyst. I had to receive training on the scanning electron microscope, which is the instrument that we use for our analysis. I also had to take a test about that instrument, a test about gunshot residue overall, and then following all of that, I also had to take a competency exam.
Okay. And can you tell us, you mentioned that you also supervise?
Yes, I'm the manager of the department as well.
So how many individuals do you supervise?
Right now, just one.
And so you're responsible for overseeing their work as well?
Yes, absolutely.
And how many times have you ever testified in court regarding the area of GSR?
84 previous times.
And in the state of Florida?
Yes, I believe 13 of those were in Florida.
And other states as well?
Yes, I've testified in 20 different states, as well as Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and Turks and Caicos.
Has your entire professional career in the area of GSR been with RJ Lee?
Yes, it has been.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what is gunshot residue, commonly referred to as GSR?
Yes, so gunshot residue in the broadest sense of the term is referring to all of the particles that result from the discharging of a firearm. However, when I am talking about gunshot residue, I am referring specifically to the particles that come from the primer, which is one of the parts of the cartridge.
Okay. And what is the primer? And you can give us kind of a summary because we did hear from an expert yesterday regarding it.
Sure. So when you're thinking about a cartridge, it has the projectile or the bullet in it. It has gunpowder. And then at the bottom of the cartridge is something called the primer cap. And inside of there is a mixture called the primer. And that contains a couple of different compounds that together contain the metals of lead, barium, and antimony.
So lead, barium, and antimony.
Yes.
Okay, we'll remember those three. So how is it that gunshot residue is produced and deposited in a manner in which you then analyze?
So whenever a firearm is discharged and the trigger is pulled, this causes something inside of the firearm called the firing pin to strike the primer cap. So it'll hit the bottom of that cartridge and this will start a reaction. So this will cause the primer to burn, and the burning of the primer causes the gunpowder to burn. So as the gunpowder burns, there is a buildup of high heat and as a result, high pressure inside of the firearm. And that buildup of pressure is what ultimately will expel the bullet from the firearm. But because of that buildup of heat, those different elements I mentioned, such as the lead, barium, and antimony, are also going to heat up and become a gas. And this gas will exit the firearm through any available openings in the form of a vaporous cloud called a plume. So you have this gas exit the firearm, and it's now much cooler outside of the firearm than it was inside of the firearm. So those different metals will cool down and combine together and form particles, and those particles will land on the area surrounding the discharge, and those are the particles that I am looking for in my analysis.
And in general, how far is that gas traveling?
It depends on the environmental conditions. Things like weather and airflow can play a role, but in static conditions, typically about 4 to 6 feet.
Okay, and you mentioned the particles. What are the particles that are being produced by the discharge that you're looking for?
So there are 3 different types of primer-related particles. So the first are called particles characteristic of gunshot residue. And these would be particles that have lead, barium, and antimony all together in one particle. So these are considered characteristic because there are very few other sources of these particles aside from the discharge of a firearm, and it is the presence of those that we need to have to be able to call a sample positive for gunshot residue. There are also what are called two-component particles, which would be any particle that contains 2 of those 3 metals. So it could be lead and barium, or lead and antimony, or barium and antimony. And these 2-component particles also can come from the discharge of a firearm, but there are other sources of them. So when they're found by themselves, they're not as conclusive to the presence of gunshot residue because they could have come from something else. But if they're found in combination with particles characteristic of gunshot residue, they're more likely to be from the discharge of a firearm and are kind of acting as part of that GSR population. And there is a third type of particle, which is just a 1-component particle, which would be lead by itself, barium by itself, or antimony by itself. And these also come from the discharge of a firearm, but there are even more other sources of those particles to where they're not very conclusive to the presence of gunshot residue, so we at our Lee group do not report on those. We are just reporting on the characteristic particles and the 2-component particles.
And that's because, for instance, lead can be found in paint.
Yes, absolutely.
So the presence of lead in and of itself isn't indicative of GSR.
Exactly.
And can you describe for us how you perform the analysis? And I know you brought up the microscope, which was briefly mentioned yesterday. Can you describe for us how that microscope works and your process?
Yes. So we use an instrument called the scanning electron microscope, which is also referred to as the SEM for short. So this is a very powerful microscope, and it is computer controlled. So instead of looking at your samples through an eyepiece like you would in a traditional microscope, you're actually looking at them on a computer screen. And this instrument has the ability to magnify by thousands of times. And it also allows you to see the chemical composition of what you are looking at. So because gunshot residue is extremely small and not visible to the naked eye and is made of very specific elements, that's why we use the SEM. And the way our analysis actually works with it is 2 parts. So the first part is an automated analysis. So I will take the samples and put them into the microscope, and I will set up parameters on the computer telling it, here are the samples I have, here's where they are located on my sample folder. From there, the computer will scan the surface of those samples, looking for potential gunshot residue related particles. If it comes across something that it thinks could be gunshot residue, it will stop and take a picture of that particle and also save the coordinates for where it is located on that sample. So it will finish going through and scanning all of the samples, and after that, I will do the second part of our analysis, which is the manual analysis. So I will go back to those particles that the instrument flagged, and I will examine them. So I will look at their shape, and I'll see if that's consistent with gunshot residue, which would be something that is smooth or round in shape as the result of a high heat reaction. In addition to that, I will look at the chemical composition of those particles and make the determination for what type of particle it is that I am looking at.
And the automated process is performed by the SEM, right, the SEM for short.
Yes.
And what is it looking for? Those particles that we discussed earlier, or the compounds, the barium?
Yes. So basically, the way the SEM works is kind of based on brightness. So the more dense something is, the brighter it will appear. Because lead, barium, and antimony are heavy metals, gunshot residue-related particles will appear very bright. So it's scanning the samples based on brightness. And if it finds something above a certain brightness, that's when it will stop and collect a spectrum to determine what elements are in there. If there's lead, barium, or antimony, or any combination of those, that's when it will save where it's located and take a picture of that particle.
And would a demonstrative aid assist you in your testimony to the jury as far as what the SEM shows?
Yes.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, the witness is going to be using a visual or demonstrative aid to assist in explaining or illustrating her testimony. Just remember that the testimony of the witness is the evidence. However, this demonstrative aid is not to be considered by you as evidence in the case unless it's later received in evidence, and you should not use it as a substitute for evidence. Only items that are actually in evidence will go back with you to the jury room during your deliberations. You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you. And without getting into the actual results, we're just going to orient the jury to the chart that I have here, beginning with the top left.
Yes, so the top left is an image kind of showing where the particle is located on the sample, and that is taken at 400 times magnification.
And the top right?
That is now a closer up image of that particle taken at 3200 times magnification, where you can see clearly that it is bright, it is round in shape, and you kind of are able to visualize really the morphology of that particle.
And bottom left?
So that is what is called the EDS spectrum. Basically, it's just showing you what elements are present in that particle. So PB is lead, BA is barium, and SB is antimony. So you see peaks for all of those present in that particle. Therefore, it is a particle that contains lead, barium, and antimony, which makes it characteristic of gunshot residue.
And are the peaks that we see consistent with the amount of that compound within the sample?
Yes, overall, the height of the peaks relate to how much of that element is in the particle.
And finally, the bottom right.
So that is the image that the instrument takes during the automated analysis.
And did you receive a sample in this particular case for analysis?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, approaching defense counsel has been previously marked the state's LLL for identification purposes. Your Honor, permission to approach the witness?
You may.
And if you need to handle anything biological, there are gloves right there, and the top has been open for ease of access. Tell me if you recognize it first, and if you need to open it, if you can just keep it outside the view of the jury.
I do recognize it.
And how is it that you recognize it?
This is one of the items that I received in this particular case.
And it was one sample, and what did that sample contain?
It contained a collection stub labeled as coming from the inside of a Jeep.
Okay. And is that in the same or substantially the same condition as the last time you saw it?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move into evidence which is pre-marked the state's LLL as the next numbered exhibit.
No objection. Thank you. It'll be admitted. What's the next number?
60.
60 in evidence. Thank you.
Looking for 57. I'm showing you what's been entered into evidence. It states 57. Do you recognize that?
I do, yes.
And what is that?
This is a gunshot residue kit that we received in this case.
Okay. And did you analyze states 57?
Yes, I did.
And did you ultimately analyze state 60?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So, grab your scissors. Go ahead and open states 57. And I'm going to ask permission from the judge for you to step down.
You may.
If you want to open it, grab some gloves, and we'll
Okay.
go to the machine.
Just if you can publish states 57.
And the contents. So you received one sample, but there are two tubes.
Yes.
What are they representative of?
These were samples that we had received that are labeled as coming from the right hand and the left hand.
And who's the individual?
Cortlen Henry.
And you can put those back in. And if you can publish states 60. And we have one tube, and what is that representative of?
It is labeled as coming from inside of a Jeep.
If you believe it, it will adjust. Thank you. You can put it back in and keep your seat. Okay, we're going to start with case 57. Did you ultimately have a chance to analyze and go through this SEM process, which is the automated process, and your individual process, in order to come up with an opinion as to the presence of GSR?
Yes.
And what was that opinion? And if you can specify both the left and then the right.
So the right hand of Cortlen Henry contained 0 particles characteristic of gunshot residue and two component particles. And the left hand contained 1 particle characteristic of gunshot residue and 1 2-component particle.
Okay. And can you explain to us what that means?
Basically, overall, there was gunshot residue present on the hands.
Okay. And what affects the presence or absence of GSR on a person's hand or any object?
Sure. So if there is gunshot residue on someone's hands, that means that the individual got it on themselves by either discharging a firearm, being in the proximity of a firearm when it was discharged, or by coming into contact with a surface or object with gunshot residue on it.
Okay. And if we may go back to the demonstrative aid, what was this demonstrative aid? Was this representative of your results of Cortlen Henry?
Yes, that was the particle characteristic of gunshot residue that was on the left hand.
And the components, which you explained before, there are three kinds or three compounds that you were looking for, and which compounds were present in Cortlen Henry's left hand.
Lead, barium, and antimony were present in that particle.
So all three components.
Yes.
Okay, and let's move on to stage 60, which was the sample for the G. What were your results? And again, did you also go through the SEM automated process and then your individual characteristic process?
I did, yes. So there were 0 particles characteristic of gunshot residue, but at least 9 2-component particles.
Okay. And what does that mean?
So, like I mentioned, 2-component particles can come from gunshot residue, but they also have other sources. So, because of that, these results are basically inconclusive. They could be gunshot residue, but they also could be from something else, and I can't say which it is.
Okay. In your analysis and reviewing the sample, did you find anything inconsistent with gunshot residue, if I'm phrasing that correctly?
Correct, and I did not. So overall, with 2-component particles, or any of the particles we look at, oftentimes if the particles are from another source, there are other elements or amounts of elements that would be unusual to find in gunshot residue. So, for example, one common source of 2-component particles is brake pads. Brake pads typically contain high amounts of the element iron. So if I'm doing my analysis and I come across particles with high amounts of iron, I eliminate them and I do not report them because there's something about them that would suggest they're from something else. So while I still cannot call these particles gunshot residue, there was nothing about those particles that were unusual.
And I want to ask you about presumptive tests. Are you familiar with them in general?
I am, yes.
Are you familiar with the friend or foe presumptive GSR kit?
I am.
What is that kit testing?
That kit is like you said, a presumptive test that is looking for the presence of nitrates, so nitrogen-containing compounds.
Okay. So, for instance, these GSR kits are made to essentially alert to the presence of a certain compound.
Yes.
And the friend or foe kit specifically alerts to the compound of nitrogen particles.
Yes.
So the presence or absence of nitrogen particles.
Correct.
And are presumptive tests relied on exclusively?
No, they are just a screening tool. Like I mentioned, they're looking for nitrates, and there are many things that can contain nitrates. So they are not conclusive to the presence of gunshot residue or gunpowder. They are really just to be used as a screening tool.
Your Honor, movement to confirm?
Yes.
Nothing further.
Councilor Zane Cross,
Yes,
you're ready to proceed.
thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't think we've had an opportunity to meet.
No.
You got the sample from Miramar Police Department,
Yes.
specifically Detective Moretti directed it to you.
Yes.
And when we talk about GSR, or gunshot residue, you're aware that GSR can be found on clothes, right?
Yes, that's possible.
Did Detective Moretti send you any clothes of Cortlen Henry?
He did not.
He didn't send you any of the clothes?
No.
Did you know that the clothes of Cortlen Henry were collected by the Miramar Police Department?
Objection calls for speculation outside the scope of court.
Well, I don't know that calls for speculation. If she knows she can answer the question, overruled.
Were you aware that the Miramar Police Department collected Cortlen Henry's clothes?
No, I was not aware of that.
But if in your examination, had you received clothes, you could test those clothes for GSR, correct?
Yes, we can
And you-
certainly test clothing.
And you've done that many times, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Also, if someone is in a hospital, in a bed in a hospital, do you know if that person has washed their hands?
I don't.
Okay. And by washing your hands, you can get rid of GSR, correct?
Yes, hand washing can remove most, if not all, of the particles on someone's hands.
Do you know if Cortlen Henry washed his hands or changed his clothes?
I don't know that.
Could I have one moment?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Is hand washing the only thing, contrary to popular belief, that removes gunshot residue?
No, gunshot residue is easily removed in general. So with respect to the hands, any type of activity, touching or use of the hands can remove particles pretty easily. With clothing, any activity. So if the garment is touching things, if it's laundered,
If it's removed?
yes, any activity can cause particles to be disrupted or removed.
And you're an independent lab, correct?
Yes, we are.
You're not associated with Miramar Police Department.
Correct, we are not.
You're not associated with the Broward Sheriff's Office.
We are not.
So you can only test what you're submitted, correct?
Correct.
Nothing further.
One question, if I
Yes.
may. You were hired by the Miramar Police Department to perform this test then, correct?
Yes, they're the ones that submitted the samples.
Thank you.
Anything else?
No, Your Honor, nothing further.
Is this witness excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, ma'am. May I step down your excuse?